Welcome to another edition of Politics Done Right. We continue with our series, A Better Human Story by the one and only Dr. Andrew Schmookler, who is a prize-winning author, former Democratic candidate for Congress in Virginia's very rich Shenandoah Valley, former talk show radio host, summa cum laude graduate of Harvard University, PhD awarded with distinction in a program specifically created to accommodate his original theory explaining how civilization has developed, and a frequent columnist in newspapers around the entire United States. Welcome once again, Andrew Schmookler. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing okay.
Well, you know, last time we left, we had a word that I used called the shallowness of where America is, of who we've become.
Yeah.
And I'd like you to expand on that, because I think if we take a look at where society is today, how politicians are able to accomplish what they do, how politicians are able to do what they do, a lot of it has, in my opinion, to be that we have become and are becoming a more shallow nation. And to which you say?
Well, the question of what kind of consciousness has developed in America is huge. And I would like to share my own little story. When you said shallowness of culture, I had a lot of things that came to my mind because of what my life has brought me. But so I'll explain a little story about what led me to ask, well, what the hell is going on? Because the world didn't act like I believed it would act. So here's the story. A lot of this is things that our regular listeners will already recognize, but where it comes from is I had an experience in 1970 which showed me something very, very important, and I think kind of irrefutable, about the story of our species. In particular, it offered an explanation of why human history has been the way it has and why the world is as screwed up as it is. I think I've delivered in our conversations a couple of statements, which I'll just quickly rehearse, which says any creature anywhere on any planet in this cosmos that takes a step onto the path of civilization will be condemned to embark upon a destructive social evolutionary process like the one that has beset human civilization for over the millennia. I think I can prove that. And I likewise believe that my argument, which I've been working on it for a long time, and it holds water. But anyway, the ugliness we see in human history is not human nature writ large. Now, I think that if people recognized those truths, it would have a transformative effect. When I saw that on a particular day in 1970, it just changed the whole course of my life. It blew me away. I mean, it shook me to my bones. I wept.
It shook you to your bones that humanity is better than the humanity you thought it was. In other words, most people are good people.
Well, what shook me to the bones was a combination of I saw what had happened to our species and nobody else had ever seen this thing, which is really important. And it answering the question I've been wrestling with for several years at that point, which is why is the world so destructive? 1968 took me to a new place. But the other thing is I didn't know up that point, I didn't know what to do with my life. I had always been goal-directed, but, what sense does it make to fit into a world that's out of joint? Well, I got an assignment on that day, and I worked on it. I got my doctorate. I wrote a 1,600-page dissertation. I got a Ford Foundation grant to turn that big thing into something that could get published. I got it published in 1984 by the University of California Press, who treated it like a big deal. The New York Times gave it a full page. It was a big deal. And I had always envisioned if I could only get this thing out into the culture as I envisioned the culture to be, it would blow other people away too. It would change things. It would have an impact. That's why it was worthwhile to sacrifice a whole lot to get that written. So it gets out there. According to the world that I thought I lived in, something that is compellingly argued, that has big implications if it were true, would challenge the thinking world to either refute it so you didn't have to worry about what it was saying, or accept it, which means you move toward what's been shown to be true, or you keep struggling with it. But the world didn't do any of those things.
No, of course not.
Well, you say, of course not. I thought that I had fulfilled my promise when I got the book out there so well. Esquire magazine put it out there. Oh, it was great to be out of the wilderness and no longer quite the nobody. And, it was, and I thought that it was going to happen. People were getting exposed to it. It was no longer this thing that I had failed to get out into the world yet. But then they don't refute it. They don't accept it. They don't struggle with it. And when I saw that it had gotten out there, but then just been ignored,
that's the word. That's the word, ignored. And there's a lot of, when do you ignore it? A shallowness creates ignorance, but continue.
Okay. Well, so I've had, what is it? So like by the early 90s, I recognized that this thing had made its little splash and then disappeared into the depths. Yeah, and so I've had a long time to ask myself, well, why is that? What is that? Well, I can see how I got to my beliefs. I grew up with a father who was always had intellectual integrity. I thought that the thinking world would respond the way my father would. But I also think that there was a difference. I looked around, I've been aspiring to be, I'd like people to take on what I've put together, the way people, when I was growing up, took on people like Karl Marx with his systematic way of understanding human history, and Freud, who was the guy that I, as a late teenager, I got to know his thinking, and it was an important part of my thinking. I wanted to get out there, but and it wasn't happening. And then I noticed it wasn't as though other people's ideas, about big ideas, big picture ideas about how to understand the human world were getting adopted, and mine wasn't making the grade somehow. Nobody, Freud and Marx had fallen out of favor. They were no longer they no longer had followings in the world, except a very fringe in both cases. But there wasn't anybody else. And that's what got me thinking about when you said the shallowness of culture. I've been entertaining the idea, which seems to be true, that one of the ways in which our culture is shallow is we don't seek a big picture way of grasping the whole ball game, the human drama. Like when I talk about the crisis in America, it's always part of a whole human drama that's been unfolding since the beginnings of civilization. I draw the lines. I've been cultivating this picture. It's all part of the same thing. And it's part of helping us see what the nature of the battle is and seeing what the nature of the battlefield is. And I think it's really important that we don't just see the news of the day, but we see the big picture. And yet, there are people who are thinkers in our time. I could list a few, but they're not at the magnitude of what Freud or Marx did. They're not trying to show a whole big vista, and whether accurately or inaccurately, what both of those guys declared showed something that you could apply to the human story in general, whether it's class conflict in the case of Marx, or the role of the unconscious in the case of Freud, interpreting Greek myths and such.
Let me interrupt you for a second, because I think you're hitting on something that sometimes I wonder, it's right in front of all of us and it's not seen, right? You mentioned about the provocative and probably fact-based nature of, let's say, Freud and Marx and others. And what did we want to occur to those? We wanted those to fall out of favor. We wanted to be able to ignore those things, because
why would we? I mean, why wouldn't we want to have a? I mean, I don't buy either of those pictures.
You buy your own. You buy your own. And why do you buy your own? Because it makes sense. Okay. To you, it makes sense. To me, it makes sense.
But why wouldn't people want the world to make sense?
That's where I'm going. That's where I'm going. If we start thinking not just for the now, if we start having critical thoughts, what makes this happen? What allows this to happen? How does humanity behave instinctively in a natural? It creates a problem from something you speak about all of the times, and that is the gangster. There are a lot more of us than there are the gangsters.
Oh, okay, so you're saying, I think what you're saying is that the gangster force.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk about it as a force, not the. But anyway,
right, got it.
That it has an interest,
right,
in keeping us fragmented in our thinking.
Yes.
So we can't see the force that we need to fight and overcome.
Exactly. And it's obvious. Again, let's forget about your personal ideology, but Karl Marx had a vision. If Sigmund Freud had a vision, you have a vision, and you believe if people were to see the logic behind what you are doing, it'll even if they don't necessarily agree, it'll cause them to think critically. And in the process of thinking critically, just what may they have come up with?
But there's a piece needing to be put in here.
Go ahead.
You and I have agreed that that our inability to see the big picture serves, I will say, the force of brokenness.
Yes.
Okay. That doesn't by itself explain why it is that the thinking world would be disabled or reoriented. I mean,
it does.
Let's say in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, America, the force of brokenness was alive in the world. They always had an interest in keeping people from seeing certain things.
Right.
But nonetheless, people were looking for something that would explain why the world was the way it was, whether it be civilization and its discontents as a way of understanding it from Freud, or the class conflict from feudal to capitalist to proletarian state or whatever. People had an appetite for it. How did it come to be? I mean, are we to say that that the force of brokenness was able to make people unable or uninterested? It's more meaningful.
I think
when you see the big picture.
I think it's a process. I think it was a marginally slow process. I saw last night as I was blogging at about 1 or 2 in the morning, I was watching. You ever heard of a woman's? Her name is Elizabeth Holmes. She
Oh,
was
yeah, she's been convicted of fraud.
right. Okay. And you watch Elizabeth Holmes' story, and you talk about learned people, very smart people, both politically and scientifically. The people scientifically knew that what she was talking about really sounded like junk. The people in that had power were concerned about if that junk is true. You just watch how the machination went that this fraud from a girl who started at 19 years old with the fraud all the way up to her age now, which is 39. I looked at that, and believe it or not, I thought about you and brokenness and the gangster.
Are you saying
her as the gangster? Yeah.
Are you saying that the minds of the people whom she conned manifested some inabilities that are relevant to this conversation?
Yes. Yeah. Actually, I think you hit it on the nail. I think you nailed it, because what happens is the way our minds work. Look, it doesn't matter that you're a scholar. You happen to be a scholar who are strong-minded. There are not many scholars that are strong-minded. We have that they'll come out and they'll tell their theories, but if one fights back too hard, they don't lose belief in their theory, but they go ahead and they keep it to themselves.
Can I take this conversation back to me?
Absolutely.
Okay. So here I am. I just turned 77 this week.
Happy birthday. Belated.
I probably have reached at least the halfway point.
There you go.
So I happen to believe my life would be simpler if I didn't. That what I've put together, if it did occupy some significant space in how people in the world think about the human story and the challenges we face, I happen to think it would have a beneficial effect. I think that we would be, and a beneficial effect, I mean, make it improve the likelihood that human civilization will survive the next couple centuries, as opposed to culminating in some kind of self-inflicted catastrophe.
Well, I would say that it's doing that already. I mean, the fact that, I found you knew about you.
So to take it back to the shallowness of the culture, I'm about to take my show on the road in a couple of new ways. And one of them is putting out a series on daily costs, where I appear regularly as a reasonably well-respected political commentator talking about the immediate situation.
And by the way, let me interrupt, folks. He put an article out there at Daily Kos that simply went viral. I kind of got some notifications in it, and I said, well, guys, I got him first. You guys just are getting the leftovers of what brother Schmookler has to say.
It's the big picture that's my life's mission.
Yes.
I mean, I want to do whatever I can to help American democracy survive. And I've worked on that pretty full time since I saw what we were up against in 2004.
Right.
So that's sort of a...
Hey, Andy, your camera kind of bumped. Yeah, I want to see your picture. Yeah, there you go. That's fine.
Oh, I'm sorry.
When you come too close, the head gets chopped. There you go.
Yeah, that's a metaphor for the whole thing, I guess. But yes. So we're talking about, it could have a beneficial effect. I just, whether anybody else believes it or not, is that belief.
No, I'm other people. Okay. I'm not you.
Okay.
And I'm telling you that in as much as there is for certain things that I disagree with you on, I think your message is so powerful. First of all, I just got glued to a better human story, because those people who believe in our humanity, who believe we're better than what we look like, I think those are the people that we should be concurrently promoting. Go ahead, sir.
Well, it's interesting. You should focus on that. I'm going to have to think about that. That might be a direction I should take some things. But if the culture is shallow in the ways that you're talking about, that's one obstacle. And I'm about to put this stuff, the best of my ability, I'm working on it in several different ways, presenting the big picture on daily costs where people are there because they're interested in the battles of this moment, which I'm interested in too. So I write about those. But I'm now wanting to show the thing that's my life's mission to show, which is the big picture, the better human story, which even helps us understand and fight the current battle better than we've been doing. So it doesn't mean, oh, let's stop paying attention to this fascistic force that's taken over the Republican Party. Let's understand what it is and where it came from and what its components are and the force of evil that's involved here, that's expressing itself here. That's a function of the forces that we unleashed as soon as we took on the path of civilization, and it was inevitable that we would. I want people to see that that's where our species story has been, and it means we're better creatures than we should have been. It means that we can see more clearly the nature of the challenge we face in saving American democracy and in preventing civilization from destroying itself. It's all part of one big picture, and we can fight and win better if we see it. That's where I'm coming from. How do I get that across to the world as you see it as so shallow?
Well, I tell you something. I have to tell it to you in a short story. And by the way, we're going over today because the conversation is so sweet. Okay, but this is what I actually. So I was on a board of a particular organization where I did a lot of blogging and I wrote a whole lot of notes. And in that note, I would have these headlines that would piss the leaders, the other leaders off. And we'll go into meetings and they'll Egberto, why are you saying it that way? Or why are you doing that? And I said, to get eyeballs. And he said, but that's not what we're all about. To get eyeballs, you're messing with the message. And I said, and then the other part they said is, but you have a title like that, and when you read the story, it is so it's nothing like the title, and it tells you so much. And I'm like, it is like the title. It just got their attention to go ahead and be willing to digest what was given. And that is the magic. You ask, how do we get a shallow people to start listening to us? You go meet them. In other words, you are not shallow. And if you stay in your lane, you are only going to meet people in your lane, people with your level of intellect, people with your level of unshallowness. To be able to get to those others, you have to meet them where they are. And that is the most difficult part of it all.
I want to start with, I write these things up, and I'm writing a 20-minute sermon that I'll probably be going around the country and giving to like Unitarian churches. Mm-hmm. I used to do that kind of thing in the 80s and the 90s anyway, but I haven't done it since I lived in New Mexico. And mm-hmm. But suddenly I have something to say, which is kind of the message. As the present title of the thing is, let me get up there. Well, basically, it's got to do with how important it is to see the humans, how the evolutionary perspective gives us a better human story.
I love that. You see, I love that. I think every time, there are times that you keep telling somebody how bad they are or how bad XYZ, and they immediately live up to their expectation. I'll tell you another little quick story with my kid, who is a Black Latina, of course, like her daddy. She went to a school, and there was a time where, she took all AP courses, and they were encouraging her not to take these courses. And what I tried to illustrate to other parents, because other parents did follow their lead, and they'll come and, like, Berta, my daughter wanted to go into AP, and they suggested that she goes to the regular, standard program. what happens too often in society is either we live up or we live down to people's expectations, or we allow other people to allow us to live down to the expectations they have of us.
Funny that you should talk about expectations, because what I say about why it's important to understand that the ugliness we see in human history isn't human nature writ large. Right. I mean, I think that people, if they think for a minute, they'll recognize that if that could be proved, that would have a big effect on how we see ourselves.
Interestingly, Dr. Schmookler, let me tell you the reason I adapted the methodology that I adapt with my right-wing brothers and sisters, right? Because if I go into a Starbucks without talking about, hey, I'm your pinko liberal, I'm your pinko progressive, I can sit down and talk to somebody about your kid, about your wife, about the illnesses that they have and all these things. And it turns out like, wow, this guy's a nice guy. Then I say, hey, I'm a liberal. I said, you're what? You've got horns, So I've learned I've proven what you've preached for quite some time now.
Well, let me say something about my limitations, because I'm willing to claim what I've done with my strong suit.
Right.
I know what I've done, but I feel a couple of limitations right now, and I'm grateful to you because I think you're helping me overcome them by your role in the conversations. One is, I'm a very march to your own drummer kind of a guy. Mm-hmm. And my brother, for example, who's a therapist, he's able to form himself in a whole variety of ways to be with a whole variety of people. I'm more the cast in a particular mold,
right,
kind of a guy. And so I can listen to people and understand people empathetically, but I don't meet people on their territory. I meet them on mine. And another thing which limits me is that I'm a product of a different era.
True.
I'm watching a movie called that I got on my DVR called Friends with Benefits. Yeah. It's kind of a sweet movie, but it's also kind of shocking. I feel like, am I watching this? Am I watching You've Got Mail, or am I watching porn? And I realize that there's a generation out there watching this movie that's not having the problem I have.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the old fogey aspect of things, but I don't really, I don't feel like that. I'm intellectually trained.
Right.
And by a brilliant father and the best education you can get in America. And was always highly motivated. I made of myself everything that I could. And what it is a holistic social visionary thinker coming out of the Jewish tradition in some sense.
Andy, let me tell you something, and I say this with a lot of respect. And I say that, I love you, I like you, all that good stuff.
Did I do something bad just now?
No, you did not. You didn't at all. But what I'm saying is you are just a creature of who you are. Okay.
Yeah, and I see the limits.
Let me finish. Let me get the shocking part that I want to tell you.
Yeah.
You are a creature of who you are. You happen to be this white guy who has always who never had to compromise. If you take a listen to what you're saying, which I'm saying there's nothing wrong with that, and I would like to be this.
I want people to know that I had to compromise in that I never made a living.
I know, but what I'm trying to say, what I'm really trying to say here is more so than most, and you in our conversation that is very evident, right? You don't have you want people to play on your field and all of that. And that's not a bad thing. Let me get what I'm trying to say. Because this is not a critique. This is a reality. This is not a critique at all. This is just how things have evolved in this country for the sake of the people. Now, in this conversation that we have, right, we are able to expand the horizons of all kinds of folks that are listening to us. Because in the areas where, because of history, you are not used to, let's say, doing certain kinds of compromising or whatever, others are. And in that machination of people with these different points of view, etc., your message as well gets through. And that's why, I know who you are when I said, hey, let's do this series. And I really enjoy them because, again, there is so much to learn, and there's so much that someone like you adds to this entire discussion. And I love the title, A Better Human Story.
Yeah, and one of the things that you said earlier had to do with being better creatures than we thought ourselves to be. When I first wrote The Parable of Tribes, I emphasized how it was, in a sense, humbling news, that we have not been the masters of our own destiny, that we have been the victims of forces that we unwittingly unleashed. So I announced it as humbling news, building off of what Freud said. Copernicus showed us that we weren't at the center of the universe. Mm-hmm. Darwin showed us that we weren't a special creation. And now, says Freud, I show us that we're not masters in our own consciousness. And then I said, and now I show the bad news, the humbling news, that the course that we've taken in civilization has not been an expression of us and of our choices. It was something we fell into that we couldn't avoid.
And go finish your thought. I'm sorry.
So then, in recent years, when I came up with A Better Human Story, I came up with this thought, which I think, which you're directing me back to also, which is that bad news, in a way, that we're, this thing's out of control. The human civilization is and always has been out of control. I think that should be written up as a theme in its own. But
don't forget to title it.
Where was I there?
Well, let me tell you where you are, because we are way over time. And what I want people to do is come back for what we are going to talk about, because Andy ended today's conversation in a very important spot in A Better Human Story.
Let me just finish that thought, because you'll like it.
Okay, go ahead.
That I realized that I should talk about the good news there, that we have fought ourselves to be as ugly a species as you would get the impression we were if you watched all the ancient civilizations emerge out of hunting-gathering societies to arrive at the tyrannies and empire building and slavery that we see throughout wherever it showed up. Imagine that if what the good news of saying, that's not who we are. It didn't matter what our nature was. Any creature would have become the same ugly thing.
Dr. Andy Bard Schmookler. We will continue this conversation about who we really are. Thank you so kindly for having been on Politics Done Right.
Well, I'm grateful to you, Egberto.
We spend a lot of time deconstructing the news, trying to parse it into a form that everybody can understand. We try to find those little nitpicks where it flies above the fray, etc. If you really like these videos that we do, I want to ask a big favor. Please go ahead. Number 1, subscribe to our channel. And number 2, please join if you can. Thank you so kindly for watching. Keep watching. Please remember to share. We must populate the entire internet with our progressive message, a message that we know is what most Americans say that they want. So help us, please join.